How much would you expect to pay for these systems? Look at this. Mac Pro 2010, 64 gigabytes of RAM, 2 6-core processors. We've got our Googleplex server, 12 cores, 64 gigabytes of RAM. We've got our dual Xeon E5, 2670, also 64 gigabytes of RAM. We've got our i5 2500s, 8 gigs of RAM each, SSDs, Zotac 750 graphics card. Yes, how much would you expect to pay? We got low prices, stereo warehouse, car stereos, tape decks, CDs.
I think you've had too many M&Ms today. Time to stop. Now, we promised you that we're going to show you exactly where to get one of these cheap computers to start out with your budget build. And we've teased you long enough.
We're going on a field trip.
Yeah, we're gonna literally show you where we got it, and it's gonna blow your mind. But first, we gotta set some expectations about how this whole process works.
Do not drink from any of the cups.
Bring your own fluids, and you're gonna need them because it takes a long time to go through these kinds of places.
So, before we get to the field trip place, there are other different kinds of places that you can find a deal. But generally, you've got to get to the computers before somebody else gets to them, because time is money, and if somebody else has touched them, you're going to be paying for their time too.
Yeah, that's right. So you got to get it out of your head that places like eBay and Craigslist are your go-to sources, because rarely is anybody selling on there without having already refurbished it and fixed it up a little bit.
Put a lot of time into it that you'd have to pay for.
Right, and you don't want to pay for time here. You want to spend time, not money, because you're looking for a budget build.
Yep, and that's how you can save a few bucks. So timing is also interesting. The place that we're going to go, you can generally go anytime, but the best deals to be had are things that only occur once a year, twice a year, 4 times a year, something like that. They're generally around surplus property auctions and other types of property auctions that you get that are government auctions, that are university surplus, school surplus. Sometimes you can get other kinds of surplus from like banks and large corporations that handle their own surplusing of equipment. And so these things are not online generally, because putting it online involves somebody's time putting it online. And so if it is online, it's going to be like, here's a pallet of Mac G5s. Would anybody like to buy a pallet of Mac G5s? And it's like, it's not really. If you're doing a budget build, you're probably not going to buy a pallet of machines.
The other thing you have to keep in mind, you're going to spend time doing research. Unless you have a really, really deep knowledge about all these different kinds of systems and what their limitations and which are best, you're going to have to spend time. You're going to have to see what they've got and then decide what's best for you and what might run into a roadblock later on.
Yeah.
And so, if you have an internet connection, you can take with you a phone or something like that, and expect to spend a considerable amount of time learning as you're doing this process.
Yeah, the first expectation you have to drop is that you're going to get a complete system. You're not. You're going to have to Lego this thing together. You're literally pulling yourselves up by your bootstraps in order to build a machine like this. This is what I did growing up. This is what I did. I grew up in a place that had a population density of like 5 people per square mile, and I was able to equip myself with technology in an era when there was no technology, there was no real internet connections to speak of. The first outside world connections I had was not to the internet, it was to bulletin board systems, through modem, through phone lines. It's archaic. And I was able to do and apply the stuff that we're talking about in order to locate machines. But if you're like, I'm going to go to Craigslist and find a machine that's got a 7970 and 8 gigs of RAM and be ready to go. No, that's not how this works. You got to put the time in, and you got to be ready with that expectation. Because you're going to be doing that work, you need at least 3 tools in your toolbox. Maybe you could get away with 2, but you're going to need a phone so that you can look up stuff, a multi-tool so you can take stuff apart and play with things. I use a Victorinox, like a Swiss Army knife, but it's the Cyber Tool one, so it's got all sorts of fun parts. And a USB drive that you can boot Linux off of, because Linux will let you boot a machine and see what kind of CPU it has in it and that sort of thing without taking it apart.
So it's a question not just of, do I want a cheap computer? Everybody wants a cheap computer. But how bad do you want it? Are you willing to jump through the hoops to get it? Because at these prices, there are hoops.
Can you and 3 or 4 of your friends get together and go in and get half a pallet of machines and do something with that? Yeah, maybe. So if if you're going to go the auction route, what do you look for? It's like, well, look for university surplus space. Go to Google and search university surplus and then school near you. If you're a student in university, a lot of the time you can talk to the people in the IT department and start, the way that you ask the question is, what do you do with your surplus equipment? Is there a yearly auction? Is it, every semester? How do you get rid of your old equipment? And a lot of the time there will be a company that handles the surplus equipment and removing the hard drives, scrubbing the hard drives, erasing information, that sort of thing. Sometimes the IT department handles it directly. But you'll want to talk to your university IT department because sometimes you can get in good with the company that handles that. Sometimes if your IT department learns that you're putting together a machine for yourself, the people there will help you out and they'll say, well, I can't give you a computer, but here's our, we're throwing away some empty cases and some other random crap, Wednesday at 5 p.m. So be here as we're chucking stuff into the dumpster and you can maybe, get a machine that we're otherwise going to chuck into the dumpster. But don't expect running machines, expect dead machines. But hey, got a machine that's hit by lightning, processor probably still works. You can harvest that out of there and it's fine.
Now, another thing that you want to keep in mind is you aren't going to a place that has prices listed on things. They're not on shelves with nice prices on the bottom, and they're not categorized in any sane way. So you need to know not only what you're looking for, but how much you should pay for it. What's too much, what's a great deal, and what's a terrible deal on something that you might not know a lot about. And that's where eBay and Craigslist can enter into it. You don't necessarily want to buy from there, but that's a great place to go and see what a working system that has the components you're looking for is going for, or the components themselves.
Yeah.
And you don't necessarily want to pay that price. That might be like the absolute most that you'll pay for it.
Yeah.
Is what it's selling for on eBay, Craigslist, services in other countries. What's the Australian? Gumtree on Australia.
Yeah. Gumtree is really handy in Australia. So like for the i5 2500s we were looking at last time, a quick search on eBay for refurbished systems somebody has put together is between $100 and $200. What does that tell you about the price that person paid for that system? It's not going to be much. So that you're paying for the time that they put into the system to make it operational and have parts and that kind of thing, and it's not going to have a reasonable graphics card. It's just going to be a working machine. But for us, it's like a scratch and dent. We don't care. Is it missing a power supply? We don't care. Is there RAM missing from it? Well, that's probably okay if we can get RAM from somewhere else. Those kinds of things don't bother us, and it shouldn't bother you either if that's what you're looking for in terms of a good deal. It also shouldn't bother you at all to, mix and match new and old parts to the extent that you can for compatibility reasons. Sometimes you got to be careful. Like you don't want to accidentally order low power DDR3 for like an older Sandy Bridge machine that's asking for trouble. You maybe have to get used RAM off of eBay. You can get into situations where old parts are not necessarily compatible with new parts because not all DDR3 is exactly the same. So you got to really do your homework and you got to really sort of know what you're up against.
You also, when you talk about old parts, these kinds of places are going to have a wide range of aged parts. And it's easy to stumble upon a part that's insanely low priced, but you don't realize it's going to be just a little too crappy to do what you want it to.
Yeah.
So you need to know kind of a minimum of what you're going to build. And you need to know what to stay away from in terms of this is just too old or too low powered, or this form factor is just not compatible. You get the super small form factor, you're not going to be putting a PCI card in there. So, there you go. You can't use it. We've sort of talked about, we want the holy trinity here in terms of where we're going to go is surplus from universities, hospitals, big businesses, things like that, auctions, and recycling centers. Now, surplus, the problem with that is they usually want you to buy a lot of it. If you're on a budget, if you're on a $300 budget, you're not going to get a pallet. It's outside, unless like you said,
you might get lucky, huh?
Yeah, well, but yeah.
And then you're going to eBay everything you don't need. It's going to be a lot of your time.
Could be a way to go. You can make money doing that. But for the most part, you're probably going to want to buy one thing at a time. So that's the problem with that. Auctions can have the same problem, but even if they have individual pieces, 4 times a year, maybe.
Yeah.
How soon do you want this? Do you have to? And plus, it's an auction. Somebody could outbid you. So you might not get that rock bottom price. So we're going to take you to a recycling center.
Yes.
That is, in our opinion, the way to go. If you can get that access, you're going to want to go there because It's an amazing experience. This was my third or fourth time going, and you see something new every time. Of course, it's a rotating stock, but even then, it's a crazy experience going to one of these places because it's literally wall-to-wall technology.
You never know what you're going to find. Everything from tons and tons of driver rays to industrial robotics, and it was really hard to resist the temptation to buy the integrated circuit pick and place machine. It really was.
And I don't know if you call it a problem, but anytime we go there, we come back with more than what we decided to go and get.
Maybe that's a Patreon stretch goal.
So we're going to show you some footage of this place. The location is a secret. We can't tell you where it is because these people, they
don't want to fool with you because you'll waste their time.
You're going to waste their time. Sorry, you're going to have to do that work on your own. And plus, it's in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
Your chances of you watching this and being anywhere near that place, very remote.
Yes, extremely, extremely remote.
But we're going to show you what it is and give you an idea of what you're looking for when you go on your journey. Before we do that, we're going to show you some of the things that we've brought back from there and refurbished back into life.
This is all stuff that we've gotten at surplus. So yeah. Well, I mean, obviously the lovely Corsair 750T is not something that I got at surplus, but I did actually put the surplus crap inside this lovely, lovely case, and this has made a perfectly reasonable system. The only thing that came from eBay was the processors. I replaced some E5 2600s with the 2670s on eBay, which cost very little, and then everything else is pretty much new or new-ish. Got an Intel NVMe in there and a Fury. Obviously, you're not going to find that at a recycling center, but this made a very, very awesome home machine for me that I'm going to use from now until the end of time, or about 3 years, I'd say.
This shows a good progression of total crap free parts to a nice merging of the old and the new.
Yeah.
So you don't have to go ultra cheap, but you can start ultra cheap and get nicer parts than you were going to get if you were buying everything new.
And this Mac, if you swing a Mac way, this Mac we also did a video on a while back, wherein, we actually got a few of these, but this has PCI Express SSD storage now, which is not even something anybody had thought of when this first came out. This has two 6-core processors, 12 cores, 24 threads. It did have 2 dual cores in it that necessitated a firmware upgrade. It didn't have any RAM in it. Maybe it had 4 gigs of RAM in it, something like that. But we've upgraded the RAM to 64 gigabytes of RAM, 2 processors. This is a really nice upgrade for this machine, and this is still a perfectly valid modern machine that would give a modern Mac Pro a run for its money.
And this just goes to show you that there's a wide variety of things you can find. These all came, for the most part, from the same place.
Your local recycling center. Let's take a field trip. Allow me to relay some useful information.
So here we are, wall-to-wall electronics, computers. There are things in here. It's all technology, but it's not all necessarily computer technology. There's wheelchairs in here. There's an amazing glut of
ancient medical technology gone wrong.
It's amazing, yeah. We got the anesthesia tray. That was a fun find. There was the typesetting machine. That was incredible. All sorts of cool things. But when you're looking through this, it's overwhelming. There's so much stuff. And 30 to 40% of it is useless and broken.
Yes.
So you need to know how to find what's useful and what isn't.
You can look at the labels and you can use your phone is the best advice that I can give you. So check it out. Here's a power supply that we brought back with us from, it was literally just in a server laying there. This is a Delta Electronics, which is one of the better brands, power supply. And if you read the rating on the label, it's 700 watts. But if you also smell of it, you can tell that it was used in a hospital because it has that hospital smell.
Oh yeah, very like that. It's not an unpleasant smell, but you associate it with unpleasant things because anytime you're in a hospital, it's usually bad.
But the important thing is it's clean, and so even though it's dust free, because it was used in that kind of an environment, this was probably in a server closet or somewhere that had dust. So looking for signs of dust is really not a good indicator as to what the age of this thing is. But because it's Delta Electronics and it's also very heavy, that's the other big takeaway from this power supply. 700 watts, I would guesstimate, just based on my own experience, that this power supply is good for loads up to 500 watts, 550 watts probably. And so this is a really great $5 find for a power supply. Now I've got two 6-pin PCI Express power adapters. I've got two 8-pin power adapters for CPUs because it came from some type of server. And then I've got a number of other peripheral connections. And so this is a really good used power supply for a used type system. Now, I wouldn't, if you're going to buy, a new Skylake or new KB Lake or whatever, I wouldn't recommend getting a power supply from this. But if you're looking for spare parts, or if you're looking for other parts, then there's a lot that the smell can tell you about the power supply. Not just about where it came from, but also hot electronics has a very distinctive smell. And if you find a graphics card, or you find a motherboard that has like yellowish discoloration, you can smell of it so you can learn the smell. And power supplies especially, because a lot of power supplies, especially if they're loaded, will run really hot and they'll just have that smell all the time. And so you can smell it and see if the power supply was running hot, if it was really heavy under load. And so, I smell this power supply, and it doesn't smell particularly hot, so I know that it's very unlikely that it's excessively aged. Now the electrolyte in the capacitors is going to age even if it had the lightest duty on Earth. And because it's not super dusty, I don't know if this machine was really used a lot. Because it's in a server, it was probably on. But, just digging through the stuff, it's a situation that it's like, yeah, this is probably a pretty good spare power supply. So this is a new, power supply that we'll use for bench diagnostics or whatever.
Now, you mentioned dust. And dust is a great indicator. It can be misleading, though, because they could have dusted it. And loose parts laying out, these aren't the cleanest places in the world. They don't spend a lot on.
This is behind the curtain. So this is not a retail establishment. This is where everything goes before it goes to the retail establishment. Some recycling centers will have, a front office where they've got nice cleaned up machines that are $100, $200, but again, that breaks the rule. You don't want something somebody else has spent a lot of time on.
So you can, if you have an enclosed system that you're looking to buy, that's not just a part that's laying out that hasn't been feather dusted, you can sort of look for dust. Now, sometimes they'll just grab a compressor and dust things, do a dirty job on it. That's going to defeat that. But one great trick is to look at parts of the machine that wouldn't have been dusted. We talked about tools to bring a paper clip. If it's got a CD-ROM, pop the CD-ROM with your paper clip. Even if you can't power it on, you can pop the CD-ROM. No one dusts the inside of a CD-ROM. So you can sort of get, it's like an archaeologist. It's like, oh, let's carbon date this. Oh, what kind of dust do we have? That'll give you an indication of how clean the computer was when it was used.
It's like, oh, this computer was on 24/7. You can also use your Linux USB if they've got a workbench or something. It's like, hey, can I plug this in real quick and test it? You can take your Linux USB and plug it in and boot it. And at least as far as the hard drive goes, if there is a mechanical hard drive, you can check and see how long the mechanical hard drives were on.
The other thing you want to look for is visual damage. And this can go from super obvious pregnant capacitors to very subtle integrated circuit damage. And you kind of have to know what you're going to look for. We've actually got some examples that we found while we were there of damaged parts.
Let's take a look real quick.
All right, so I feel like I'm channeling the late Steve Irwin a little bit, because it's like, oh, look what we found, she's a beaut. And everybody in Australia is like, no, what did you do? This is actually a traffic control board that was surplused from a traffic control system. But this is great, because this is exactly the kind of thing that you want to look for when you're upcycling recycled electronics. Because if you look at this circuit board at first glance, it doesn't look like there's anything wrong with it. If you pay really close attention to it, though, you can see that something looks a little bit off. Some of the surface on some of the components is a little bit damaged. There's a little bit of discoloration around the printed circuit board, and this is very likely lightning damage. And it's like, oh, you can eyeball lightning damage. Not always, but in this case you can. Now, this is from a traffic control system, so I don't think anybody's going to be putting in any stoplights anytime soon. But this is a great circuit board for illustrating this, because these are what are called through-hole components. These are ancient, from the 80s components that you literally, you can almost hit this with a hammer and it wouldn't matter. And so sometimes the damage is a little bit more subtle in modern electronics, but even this ancient electronics was not able to survive the lightning strike. Tells you what you're dealing with in terms of, electrical surges and things like that.
The other thing to look for is swollen capacitors. Normally capacitors are these cylindrical things. The top should be perfectly flat. They should not be ruptured or have anything leaking from inside them. It's still a really common failure that a lot of devices like these will have a capacitor that has an improperly formulated electrolyte internally. It's actually a really fun story of cloak and dagger and espionage as to why that is the way that it is, but we'll get into that later. The pregnant capacitors problem, honestly, is another way that you can get really, really good deals if you're good with soldering, because you can solder and replace the capacitors. And I've ended up some really, really nice stuff, like stuff that was 3 months out of warranty, and it's like, oh, I can just replace the capacitors.
And that's a real easy argument to make with these guys. Again, they're not looking to put any time into these. They're just looking to get them out the door or recycle them even maybe.
Yeah, just get the metal value out of them.
You show them that and you say, look, if there's no way this is going to work, I'll give you the metal value for it. And they'll probably just say yes.
Yeah. The thing to know if you're in the right place is, does the imagery look like this? Like, if you're in somewhere that doesn't look like it's just piles and piles of electronic recycling, you're not in the right place. You've got to keep going.
If there's more than one path through a given room, you're probably in the wrong spot.
I mean, universities, university surplus, government surplus, and recycling centers that I've been to all over the country all look like this when you're in the right place. If you're not in the right place or it looks like a store, you're in the wrong place.
Yeah, things aren't going to have prices. They're not going to have labels. They're going to be in giant piles. You might have to spend 10 minutes moving something to get to what you're looking for. But that's the point.
So we've got a machine to give away, and this is the way to enter. There's a Gleam link below. You don't have to sign up for anything. You can just enter with clicking. But if you want to do other stuff, there's more info. It's just a Gleam contest. There's also a thread on the forum, and we're going to randomly choose a winner worldwide, and we're going to ship it to you. Hopefully we can get it to you for less than $150. But we're going to give away the machine that we built in the previous video. It's an i5 with 8 gigs of RAM and a 750 graphics card, thanks to Yakinukune. So everybody thank Yakinukune or Yakinukune. And there's a forum thread, and if you've gotten some really good used deals, post what you've got. You've seen what I've got. We've got a separate build on my home computer. The garbage build is what it's called. And I run Linux and Windows on it, and I can boot Windows in a virtual machine. I can play games natively if I want. It all works really, really well. I'm super happy with it. I'm going to have that machine from now until the end of time. A lot of the older hardware you get at places like this works great with Linux. So even if you just want a second machine for Linux, this is really good. So join us. Let us know what you came up with. Let us know what you think of this. If you need help in your specific area, I'm sure there's people on the forum that'll help you find your local university surplus and your other local options. But I promise you, if I had local options growing up in a very rural place before the internet, then you're not going to have a problem.
And we want to see what you find. It's fascinating to see these places, but keep in mind, sometimes the people that run these places aren't looking for press.
Yeah.
So make sure that it's cool with them. You got to be nice to these people. These are the gatekeepers. They're going to get you these amazing deals. So check with them first. Be nice to them. Do favors for them, and you will benefit greatly.
You may even be able to build a dot matrix printer robot.
That was one phone call. Like, where are we going to get a dot matrix printer? Hey, it's got 4.
Excellent. All right. Well, thanks everybody. Hopefully this answers your questions. We'll see you next time.
See ya.
Would you say that you're a fan of Level 1? Then I think you should subscribe and thumbs up.